James Carter stood before the large glass window of his 82nd floor office in the Carter Tech Tower, gazing out at the dazzling skyline of New York. At 38, he embodied the American dream, a white man with neatly trimmed blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and a smile that could silence an entire boardroom. He had built his tech empire from a small garage in the suburbs of Boston, where he once wrote code through sleepless nights, into a multi-billion-dollar corporation that now dominated the artificial intelligence industry. Forbes magazine had dubbed him the King of Eastern Silicon Valley, but to James, that title was just a small piece of the portrait he had painted with ruthlessness and ambition. Below him, the city moved like a giant machine. Yellow cabs rushed through crowded streets, and the lights from skyscrapers shimmered like artificial stars. James loved standing here watching the world he had conquered. His office was a work of modern art, a gleaming ebony desk, Italian leather chairs, and a 7-figure abstract painting hung on the wall. Everything was arranged to remind anyone who stepped inside that they were facing not just a successful man, but an invincible one. But today, as the sunset bathed the skyline in gold, James felt a strange sensation creeping into his chest. It wasn't anxiety. He had long since learned to extinguish that feeling back in the early startup days when investors laughed at his ideas. Nor was it fatigue, for James Carter never got tired. Perhaps he thought it was just a fleeting emptiness, a moment of weakness that anyone standing at the top might encounter. He quickly dismissed it and refocused on why the entire world had its eyes on him: his upcoming wedding to Sophia Reynolds. Sophia, Hollywood's most sought-after television star, was the perfect puzzle piece for James's picture of success. With her glossy brown hair, radiant smile plastered across billboards, and millions of social media followers, she was the embodiment of perfection. The wedding, set to take place at a seaside mansion in Long Island, was predicted to be the year's event. The tabloids were calling it the royal wedding of the tech world. The guest list included billionaires, politicians, and A-list celebrities, each invited for their fame and the strategic value they brought to James's empire. The wedding was not merely a declaration of love, but a power move. James knew well that in his world, image was everything. Marrying Sophia would fortify his status in the business world and among the elite circles of high society. He had planned every detail, from the white roses imported from the Netherlands to the symphony orchestra he handpicked. There was no room for error. James Carter never let anything slip out of his control. Yet, as he sat down at his desk, scrolling through the guest list on his computer screen, a name suddenly surfaced in his mind, like an old melody, familiar yet distant: Aisha Thompson. Aisha, his ex-wife, is a black woman with a warm smile who had once made his heart tremble 10 years ago. They had met at a tech conference in San Francisco when James was just an ambitious programmer, and Aisha was a photography student dreaming of capturing life's raw moments. Their love had once burned brightly, but it could not survive in James's chosen world. Aisha had wanted a real-life quiet evenings together, spontaneous walks, a family. But James, then entangled in funding rounds and cutthroat competition, saw those desires as luxuries. He loved her in his way, but his love always came with conditions. It had to serve a greater goal. When Aisha left behind a short letter saying she couldn't live beside a man who loved his career more than people, James didn't stop her. He told himself she wasn't strong enough to stand beside him, that she was part of a past he had outgrown. Now, sitting in his office, James felt a strange urge. He hadn't thought of Aisha in a long time, but inviting her to the wedding suddenly seemed irresistibly appealing. He imagined her walking into the grand hall, seeing him in a flawless tux beside a stunning Sophia, and realizing what she had missed. It wasn't just revenge. It was a reminder that he had been right, that the path he had chosen had taken him to the top, while she was likely living an ordinary, unremarkable life. James picked up the phone and called his assistant Emma. Send an invitation to Aisha Thompson, he said, his voice deep and firm. Make sure it reaches her personally. Emma, a sharp professional young woman, paused momentarily before replying. Aisha Thompson, sir, she repeated as if needing confirmation. That's right, James answered, a slow smile forming. Let's see if she dares to show up. He hung up and leaned back in his chair, fingers interlaced. The thought of Aisha standing in the splendor of the wedding face to face with the success he had achieved brought him a cold satisfaction. She had left him, but now she would have to witness what he had become, a man who didn't just survive, but dominated. This would be when she realized her mistake, and James Carter would always be the victor. But as his eyes drifted to a photo frame on his desk, a picture of him and Sophia at a charity event, both smiling perfectly, that empty feeling returned, deeper and more persistent this time. James frowned, brushing it off like a passing thought. He was the king of the city, and there was no room for weakness in his kingdom. Yet deep within his soul, a small question began to take root. Was everything he had built truly enough to fill the void he refused to face? James Carter sat in his office, the glow from the computer screen illuminating his sharply defined features. The guest list for his wedding to Sophia Reynolds stretched across the monitor, each name a piece in the grand puzzle of power he had meticulously constructed. But his mind was no longer there. The name Aisha Thompson, the ex-wife he had just instructed his assistant to invite to the wedding, had awakened a part of his memory he thought he had long buried. It wasn't nostalgia. James Carter wasn't the man who dwelled on the past. It was an urge, a cold desire to prove that he had moved far beyond that chapter, that he was the victor in the game Aisha had once refused to play. He leaned back in his leather chair, fingers tapping rhythmically on the ebony desk. Aisha. He could still picture her even after 10 years. The natural curls of her hair, the deep brown eyes that always seemed to see through him, and that warm smile that, if only for a moment, had once made him want to be a better man. But she was also the one who had walked away and dared to turn her back on his ambition, to chase after naive ideals of love and family. At that time, James had been fighting to pull Carter Tech back from the edge of bankruptcy, fending off skeptical investors and ruthless competitors. Aisha had wanted him home in the evenings, had wished for moonlit walks and a future he couldn't promise. She didn't understand that to succeed, he had to sacrifice everything, even her. When she left, she'd left behind a short note on the kitchen counter of their small San Francisco apartment. It read, "I can't live with a man who loves his dream more than he loves me. I hope one day you find what truly matters." He had read it once, then ripped it to shreds, seeing it as proof of her weakness. Aisha wasn't strong enough to stand by him, not worthy of the kingdom he was building. He had moved on, conquered new heights, and never looked back. But now, standing atop the world, the idea of inviting her to his wedding, a wedding the world would be watching, made his pulse quicken. James smirked, the curve of his lips edged with something cruel. He imagined Aisha walking into the seaside mansion in Long Island, where the ceremony would occur. She would wear a simple dress, perhaps a little worn, her eyes filled with regret as she saw him in a perfectly tailored suit, standing beside Sophia Reynolds, radiant, like she had stepped out of a Hollywood dream. She would see the imported white roses from the Netherlands, hear the violins of the symphony orchestra, and realize what she had walked away from. It would be the moment she understood that James Carter hadn't just survived, he had dominated, while perhaps she was struggling through a mundane, forgotten life. He stood up and walked to the large window, looking down at the city of New York, bathed in the golden hue of sunset. "She'll come," he murmured to himself, voice low and certain. "She won't be able to resist the chance to see me now." He wasn't sure what made him so confident. Maybe arrogance, maybe the memory of Aisha, who had always been curious, always willing to confront the truth, no matter how painful. He remembered the times she looked him straight in the eye, challenging him to speak honestly about his feelings, even when he always dodged. Perhaps she still had a trace of that curiosity enough to step into his world again, only to leave her heart shattered. James returned to his desk and opened an email from his assistant Emma. She had found Aisha's address, a small apartment in Brooklyn, far from the luxury of Manhattan. He frowned, imagining Aisha living in a cramped space, maybe working as an office clerk or a failed artist struggling to pay bills. The image gave him a cold satisfaction. He typed a short message to Emma, send the invitation on the finest paper. Include a handwritten note from me. He paused, thinking for a moment, then added, I look forward to seeing her again for old time's sake. He hit send, feeling like he'd just played a move in a chess match he knew he would win. That note wasn't a heartfelt invitation. It was a disguised dagger, a reminder of how far he'd come and how little she now mattered. James didn't want Aisha back in his life. He just wanted her to witness him at the pinnacle, to realize that walking away from him had been the greatest mistake of her life. But as he shut off his computer and prepared to leave the office, a memory surfaced uninvited. It was an evening in San Francisco when he and Aisha sat together on a worn couch in their old apartment, her head resting on his shoulder, as she whispered dreams of capturing people's happiest moments through her camera. I want to preserve the beautiful things, James, she said, her voice soft but passionate. What do you want to maintain? He had laughed and replied that he wanted to preserve the world in his hands. She looked at him, eyes filled with sadness, as if she had already glimpsed the future they could never share. James shook his head, brushing the memory away like a passing cloud. Aisha was the past, and the past had no place in his world. He stepped out of the office, the collar of his expensive cashmere coat draped loosely over his shoulders, ready for an evening cocktail with investors. But as he entered the elevator, that same emptiness from the day before returned sharper now, like a warning he didn't want to acknowledge. He pressed the button for the ground floor, telling himself everything was on track. Aisha would come to the wedding. She would see him at his peak, and he would prove he never needed her. But deep in a quiet corner of his soul, a small question began to echo. Why, after everything, did he still feel the need to prove it at all? In her small Brooklyn apartment, the afternoon sunlight streamed through the window curtains, casting a warm glow on the photographs hanging on the wall. Snapshots of everyday life, captured through Aisha Thompson's lens. A child grinning on a carousel, an elderly flower vendor on a street corner, a couple holding hands in the rain. At 35, Aisha, a Black American woman with tightly coiled hair, tied up high, and deep brown eyes, had made photography a sanctuary for her soul. Her apartment wasn't spacious, but it overflowed with love laughter and the presence of her 3 sons, Malik, Noah, and Isaiah, who were her entire world. Aisha stood at the kitchen counter, holding a thick, cream-colored envelope made of silk paper, the embossed logo glinting under the light. She recognized instantly that it didn't belong in her world, a world far from the luxury and power she had walked away from 10 years ago. The envelope was from Carter Tech, the company of James Carter, the ex-husband she had once loved so deeply it had felt impossible to live without him. She set it down on the table, her heart pounding as if merely touching it had stirred up a storm of emotions she had worked hard to bury. She didn't want to open it. Part of her wanted to throw it in the trash and pretend it never existed. But Aisha was not someone who ran away. She had learned to face every challenge head-on, from those early days of single motherhood, crying while changing Malik's diapers in a cramped apartment to sleepless nights, editing photos to afford tuition for her boys. She took a deep breath, opened the envelope, and pulled out the invitation. Elegant cursive lettering appeared: James Carter and Sophia Reynolds cordially invite you to their Long Island seaside estate wedding. Aisha read the lines repeatedly, as if the words might change if she stared long enough. Attached to the card was a small note, James's firm handwriting, unmistakable. Aisha, I look forward to seeing you again for old times' sake. She let out a bitter laugh, echoing in her quiet kitchen. Old times, she muttered. To James, memories were perhaps nothing more than moments of conquest. But to her, they were scars. Nights spent waiting for him to come home, only to receive a brief apology text. The countless times she tried to convince him that love mattered more than ambition. And the moment she walked away heartbroken and carrying a secret she had never shared. She set the invitation down, her eyes drifting to the photo on the refrigerator. Malik, Noah, and Isaiah, beaming in the park sunlight, illuminating faces that looked hauntingly like James's blue eyes, strong chins, confident smiles. Her sons were the reason she never regretted leaving James and could never fully let go of the past. Malik, the bold 9-year-old, had recently begun asking Mom, "Who's my dad?" Noah, age 7, shy but perceptive, often looked at her with eyes that seemed to seek answers to unspoken questions. Isaiah, 6, quiet and introspective, drew pictures of a complete family he had never known. Aisha always told them a partial truth. Your dad is a very busy man, but I love you enough for both of us. But she knew the day they demanded the whole truth was drawing near. She sat down, wrapping her hands around a cup of coffee gone cold, her mind returning to San Francisco 10 years ago. She and James had loved fiercely, like two stars colliding in the universe. He had been a driven programmer, and she was a photography student, dreaming of capturing the world's beauty. They had once envisioned a future together, but James's dream grew until it consumed everything else. He worked to exhaustion, missed her birthdays, and forgot small promises. When she begged him to spend time with her, he only said, Aisha, you don't understand. I'm doing this for us. But she had understood that us was just an excuse for his ambition. When she discovered she was pregnant with Malik shortly after leaving him, she had intended to tell James. She called him, but his cold voice on the phone, Aisha, I don't have time for this, had crushed that intention. She feared that if he knew, he would try to control the children, turn them into tools for his empire, or worse, abandon them as he had abandoned her. So she raised them alone to build a complete life, despite financial struggles. She worked day and night weddings events, anything to give her sons a home. She had never once regretted it, but every time she looked into her sons' eyes, she wondered if she had been right to keep their father a secret. James's wedding invitation felt like a challenge, a blade from the past, piercing into the present. She knew he hadn't invited her out of affection. James Carter wasn't a man of nostalgia. He wanted her there to prove he had won, that the life she chose was a mistake. She could picture his smug smile standing beside Sophia Reynolds in a world Aisha had once rejected. Part of her wanted to decline to protect her heart from reopening old wounds. But another part, stronger, more resolute, refused to give James that victory. She walked to her bookshelf, and pulled out an old photo album. She flipped to a picture of her and James at a tech conference, both laughing, hands clasped. She had loved him, loved the man he could have been if he had chosen love over power. But that man no longer existed, and Aisha was no longer the naive girl she once was. She had become a mother, an artist, a survivor of every storm life had hurled at her. If James wanted her to face him, she would, but not on his terms. Aisha returned to the kitchen, her eyes resting on the 3 backpacks hanging on the wall. Malik's with a basketball patch, Noah's with a superhero badge, and Isaiah's covered in scribbled doodles. Her boys deserved to know who their father was, whether the man was worth learning. She would bring them to the wedding, not to please James, but to show them the truth, and to show James what he had missed. The decision weighed heavy on her chest, but also brought a strange sense of freedom, as if she were reclaiming authorship of her own story. She picked up the invitation, folded it, and placed it in a drawer. "All right, James," she whispered, voice steady. "We'll meet again. But this time, you won't get to decide the ending." Outside the window, Brooklyn pulsed with the sound of children playing and car horns, a world entirely different from James's kingdom. Aisha smiled, a smile laced with pain and resolve. She was ready to face the past, not for him, but for herself and her sons. Aisha Thompson stood in the small living room of her Brooklyn apartment, the soft yellow glow of the lamp casting warm light over the photographs on the wall, snapshots she had taken through her lens. A mother cradling her child in the park, a street musician playing saxophone beneath neon lights, an elderly couple holding hands on a bench. Each photo was a story, a fragment of the life she had rebuilt from the ashes of her past. At 35, Aisha, a Black American woman with her coiled hair tied high and eyes filled with resolve, had turned photography into her healing from the wounds James Carter had left behind. But the secret she carried her 3 sons, Malik, Noah, and Isaiah, was something she had never shared with him, and now it was rising inside her like a wave too strong to hold back. She sat in her worn armchair, still clutching the wedding invitation from James, now crumpled from being opened and folded over and over. His handwritten note, "Aisha, I look forward to seeing you again, for old time's sake," felt like a dagger to the heart. She knew James hadn't sent the invitation out of affection. He wanted her there to gloat, to show her that he had become the king of the city beside Sophia Reynolds, while she in his mind was nothing but a faded silhouette from his past. But James didn't know the truth she had kept hidden for 10 years. Malik, Noah, and Isaiah, his children boys, who bore his face, but were raised with her love. Aisha had never told James about the boys, and the decision hadn't been easy. When she left him in San Francisco, heartbroken and leaving behind a short letter, she didn't yet know she was pregnant with Malik. A few weeks later, she found out in a small apartment she had rented in Oakland. She had sat for hours on the floor, holding her belly and crying. She wanted to call James to believe he would change, that he would put her and their unborn child above his ambition. But the memories held her back. The dinners he missed, the broken promises, the cold voice on the phone. "Aisha, I don't have time for this." She feared that if James knew, he'd try to control the children, turn them into tools for his Carter Tech empire, or worse, abandon them the way he had abandoned her. She couldn't let her sons grow up in the shadow of that rejection, so she chose to raise them alone. The early years were a battle. She worked 3 jobs, event photography, waitressing, and part-time photography teaching, to pay rent and buy formula for Malik. The burden doubled when Noah and Isaiah were born, but she never let her children feel a lack of love. She told them stories each night, sang the songs her mother once sang to her, and taught them that family didn't need numbers, only love. She watched them grow, Malik bold and headstrong, both a source of pride and worry, Noah sensitive, and always in need of her embrace. Isaiah, with his deep soul hidden in his drawings, and she knew she had been right to keep them away from James. But now, with Malik beginning to ask about his father, Noah watching her with curious eyes, and Isaiah drawing pictures of a mysterious man, Aisha knew she couldn't keep the truth from them forever. James's wedding invitation was an unexpected fork in the road. She had decided to bring her sons to the wedding, not to please James, but so they could know who their father was. But the decision wasn't only about the boys and herself. Aisha had spent 10 years building a life of independence, refusing to let the past define her. She had survived lonely nights, mounting bills and pitying glances. She had become a mother, an artist, and a resilient woman. But facing James, the man who once made her question her worth, was a challenge she had never prepared for. She stood and walked to the corner of the room, where she kept her camera, a worn Nikon she'd bought with money saved during hard times. She ran her hand over its scratched body, each mark telling a story of her perseverance. She thought of James, his smug smile, and how he would look at her when she entered that wedding. He'd expect a failed Aisha, a woman full of regret for walking away from him. But she was no such woman. She would go not to prove anything to him, but to show him what he had missed, not just her, but 3 boys who shared his blood. Aisha returned to the table and took out a small notebook where she wrote her thoughts. She penned, "Tomorrow, I'll tell the boys about the trip. I'll say we'll meet someone important, but it's up to them to decide what he means to them." She paused, her gaze resting on a photo nearby. Malik, Noah, and Isaiah laughing in the park sunlight, lighting up faces that resembled James in uncanny ways. She knew this trip wouldn't be easy. The boys might be hurt and ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. But she also knew that the truth, no matter how painful, was something they deserved. She closed the notebook, stood up, and walked to her son's bedroom door. Through the gap, she saw Malik lying on his bed, holding a basketball, his eyes dreamy. Noah was fast asleep, clutching a superhero book in his arms. Isaiah sat at his tiny desk, sketching something new, fingers gliding across paper. Aisha smiled, her heart heavy, yet steady with resolve. She would protect them as she always had. But she would also give them the chance to understand their father and allow James to face what he had left behind. Outside the window, Brooklyn buzzed with car horns and the children's laughter at play. Aisha inhaled deeply, drawing strength from the life she had built. She didn't know what would happen at the wedding, but she knew one thing for sure. She would walk into that place with her head held high, not as a victim of the past, but as a woman who had conquered it. James might think he was in control of the game, but Aisha was ready to change the rules. The seaside estate in Long Island gleamed under the June sunlight, the light reflecting off massive glass panels like flickering flames. James Carter, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, stood near the entrance to the grand hall, his icy blue eyes scanning the crowd of guests. At 38, he embodied success, a white American man with neatly combed blonde hair and an assertive posture. The wedding to Sophia Reynolds, the most sought-after television star in Hollywood, wasn't just a declaration of love. It was the pinnacle of the empire. He had built a proclamation that James Carter was untouchable. The hall was decorated like a modern palace. Rows of imported white roses from the Netherlands filled the air with a sweet fragrance. A symphony orchestra played Mozart violins, blending with laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. The guests, tech billionaires, politicians, and A-list celebrities, moved gracefully in lavish attire, each a carefully chosen piece in the powerful world James had meticulously arranged. This was his stage. He was the director, the lead actor, and the one in control of every detail. Sophia Reynolds, standing just a few steps away, was the picture of perfection. Her pearl-encrusted wedding dress hugged her figure, her glossy brown hair styled elegantly, and her smile outshone even the chandelier above. She tilted her head and whispered something to a group of guests, making them laugh. James watched her, feeling a cold kind of satisfaction. Sophia wasn't just a bride. She was a symbol, the perfect puzzle piece for the image he wanted the world to see. But beneath his confident exterior, he couldn't stop glancing toward the grand doors at the end of the hall, where Aisha Thompson might appear. The thought of Aisha, his black ex-wife, whom he had invited with ruthless intention, made his heart beat a little faster. He had imagined the moment she'd walk in, perhaps in a simple dress, her eyes full of regret, as she saw him at the peak of his power. He wanted her to witness this extravagance, see radiant Sophia beside him, and realize she had been wrong to walk away 10 years ago. James didn't admit it to himself, but the invitation wasn't just revenge. It was a way to fill the strange emptiness that had haunted him ever since he ordered the card to be sent. He adjusted his tie and smiled at a newly arrived investor who reached out to shake his hand. "James, you've exceeded all expectations," the man said, full of admiration. James nodded his reply, smooth as ever. "Thank you, but this is just the beginning." But as the man walked away, James's eyes again drifted to the doors. Aisha hadn't replied to the invitation, hadn't confirmed whether she would attend, and that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He told himself it didn't matter whether she came or not. He was still the victor. But a part of him, deep and uncontrollable, wanted her here to see her face when she confronted his success. James recalled their last conversation over the phone, just weeks after she left. Her voice had been cold, almost distant. "James, I don't want to stay in contact. I hope you get what you want." He had hung up, furious that she dared to cut him off, but also relieved that she was no longer a burden. Now he wondered what she had become. A failed artist, an office worker struggling to pay bills. He imagined her living an ordinary, unremarkable life, and that image gave him cold satisfaction. But why, he asked himself, did he need her to see him now? Why did he feel the need to prove he was right? Sophia stepped over and placed a hand on his arm, her red-painted nails standing out against the black fabric of his tuxedo. "Everything okay, love?" she asked gently, though her sharp eyes betrayed a hint of suspicion, as if she sensed his distraction. James smiled, the flawless smile he had practiced in the mirror 1,000 times. "Perfect," he replied, kissing her lightly on the forehead. But as she turned away to continue chatting with a group of guests, he felt a subtle, invisible gap between them. Sophia was everything he had wanted. Beautiful, intelligent, famous. But she wasn't Aisha. Aisha had once seen straight through him, had loved him for who he was, not for the empire he built. He shook his head, brushing the thought away. Aisha was the past, and today was about the future. He checked his watch, 10 minutes until the ceremony would begin. He signaled to the event coordinator, a young woman wearing a Bluetooth headset, to ensure everything proceeded according to plan. "The main entrance," he said quietly. "Notify me if anyone special arrives." She nodded without asking questions, though her curious glance made James frown. He didn't want to explain. No one needed to know about Aisha, or the private play he had scripted to assert his dominance. James stood tall as the orchestra shifted to a slower piece and drew deep breaths. This was his moment. The moment the world would see James Carter not just as a billionaire, but as a man who had conquered everything. He cast one last glance at the doors, his heart beating faster than he cared to admit. Aisha might not come, but if she did, he was ready. He would show her who he had become, and she would leave shattered, just as he had been when she walked away from him. But as he stepped toward Sophia, preparing for the ceremony, a strange feeling rose within him, as if he were standing at the edge of a cliff, and what was about to happen might unravel everything he had so carefully built. Outside, the waves of Long Island crashed rhythmically against the shore, the sound of the sea blending with music and laughter. James smiled the smile of a man who believed he controlled everything. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered that he might have miscalculated, and that Aisha Thompson, the woman he once underestimated, was coming to change the game's rules. The seaside estate in Long Island trembled with celebration. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above the grand hall, like stars glowing over the crowd. Clad in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, James Carter stood near the center, his icy blue eyes sweeping across the sea of powerful guests. At 38, this white American man was the embodiment of invincibility, a tech billionaire who had transformed Carter Tech into a global symbol. Today, his wedding to the dazzling television star, Sophia Reynolds, marked the pinnacle of his empire, a declaration that James Carter hadn't just conquered the world, but shaped it. Yet beneath the confident exterior, he couldn't stop glancing toward the grand doors at the far end of the hall, waiting for Aisha Thompson, his ex-wife invited with a cruel intention. The symphony shifted into a light waltz, violins weaving through laughter and the clink of champagne glasses. Sophia, in her pearl-embellished wedding gown, moved through the crowd like a queen, her flawless smile outshining even the chandelier's brilliance. James watched her with cold satisfaction, but his mind kept returning him to Aisha. He had pictured her entering in a plain dress, her eyes full of regret as she saw him at his peak. He wanted her to realize the mistake of leaving him 10 years ago, to leave shattered. But as the ceremony neared, and Aisha still hadn't arrived, a discomfort crept over him. Not disappointment, but a gnawing sense that he had miscalculated. Then it happened. The grand doors at the far end of the hall opened. A hush fell over the room, like a sudden gust of wind. James turned, his breath catching in his throat. Aisha Thompson stepped inside, her head held high, her presence commanding like a warrior entering the arena. This 35-year-old black woman was not the Aisha James had imagined. She wore a deep blue silk dress that hugged her figure, her natural curls cascading freely, her deep brown eyes emanating an unshakable strength. She hadn't come to plead or envy. She came because she chose to, and her presence made the air in the room heavy. But it wasn't just Aisha that made the entire hall fall silent. Beside her were 3 young boys, dressed in tiny suits, walking with curiosity and confidence, unmistakably inherited from both parents. Malik 9 led with sharp eyes, already sizing up the room. Noah 7 held his mother's hand, his smile shy but warm. Isaiah 6, quiet and composed, scanned the crowd with piercing blue eyes that mirrored James's own. The whispers began. Eyes darted from the boys to James. The resemblance was undeniable. The blue eyes, the square jawline, the confident smile. It was as if James Carter had been split into 3. James felt his heart thud, like an invisible force had punched him. Beside him, Sophia clutched his arm tighter, her manicured nails digging into his sleeve. He glanced at her and saw her perfect smile stiffen, her expression shifting from shock to fury. "James," she hissed, voice low and blade sharp. "Who are they?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind spun, trying to piece it all together. Aisha, the 3 boys, their faces, his sons. The truth struck him like a blade, sharp, undeniable. Aisha stopped a few meters from him, her eyes locked onto his. She didn't smile. She didn't look afraid or angry. She stood as steady as a mountain, the 3 boys at her side like tiny guardians. The entire hall waited, sensing that this moment would change everything. James could feel the eyes of hundreds of billionaires, politicians, celebrities, all zeroed in on him. But all he could see was Aisha and the boys. They looked at him with curiosity, with skepticism, and something deeper he couldn't name. Malik stepped forward, eyes fixed on James. "Who are you?" the boy asked, his voice clear, fearless. The simple question echoed like thunder in the silent hall. James opened his mouth, but no words came out. He, the man who always had answers, who controlled every meeting and negotiation, stood frozen before a child's gaze. Noah squeezed Aisha's hand tighter. Isaiah tilted his head as if sketching James with his eyes. Then Aisha spoke, her voice calm, but filled with the power of a verdict. "I didn't come for you, James," she said, gaze unwavering. "I came because they deserve to know who their father is." Her words crashed over him like a wave, washing away every illusion he had built. The hall erupted in murmurs, but Aisha didn't flinch. She looked at James, not with hatred or pleading, but with the confidence of someone who had already triumphed over the past. She didn't need him, but she had given her sons the chance to know him, and now the ball was in his court. Sophia released James's arm and stepped back, her face pale. "James, what is this?" she asked, her voice shaking but sharp, as if she were clinging to the last thread of her perfect image. James didn't answer. His eyes were still locked on Aisha and the boys. Malik watched him with suspicion. Noah with wonder. Isaiah had a depth that made James shiver. He had invited Aisha to make her regret, but now he felt his world unraveling. Outside, the waves of Long Island still rolled in a steady rhythm, but inside the hall, everything had changed. James Carter, the man who believed he controlled everything, was now face to face with a truth he couldn't command. Aisha had come, not as a victim, but as a victor. And she had brought with her 3 sons, his blood, to remind him that there are some things money and power can never buy. The grand hall of the Long Island seaside estate fell into a suffocating silence, as if the entire world held its breath after Aisha Thompson's declaration. "I didn't come for you, James," she said, her voice calm but sharp like a blade. "I came because they deserve to know who their father is." Aisha stood at the center of the room, her deep blue silk dress clinging to her form, her natural curls cascading over her shoulders, and her deep brown eyes fixed on James Carter. Beside her were 3 boys, Malik, Noah, and Isaiah, miniature reflections of James with unmistakable blue eyes and square jawlines. James, the white American man who once believed he controlled everything, felt his world collapse in an instant. The crowd of guests, tech billionaires, politicians, celebrities began to murmur, their eyes darting between Aisha, the 3 boys, and James. The violins of the symphony orchestra had stopped. Only Long Island's waves could be heard through the windows. Sophia Reynolds, standing beside James, let go of his arm, her nails leaving red marks on the fabric of his bespoke tuxedo. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling but cold as steel. "What is this?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on Aisha and the 3 boys, his mind spiraling with a truth he had never prepared for. He had children, and he never knew. Malik, the bold 9-year-old, stepped forward, his sharp eyes locked on James. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice clear, fearless. The question struck James like a hammer to the chest. Noah 7 held Aisha's hand tighter, his shy smile fading as he sensed the tension in the room. Isaiah 6, silent and observant, tilted his head and stared at James with identical blue eyes, as if trying to see inside his soul. James opened his mouth, but his throat was dry. He, the man who controlled every meeting and every deal, now stood speechless before the eyes of children, his sons. Aisha didn't flinch and didn't show anger or desperation. She stood unwavering as a mountain, her presence, a quiet declaration. She didn't need James, but she had given the boys the chance to know him. She looked at him, not with hatred, but with the steady gaze of a woman who had triumphed over the past. She had raised these boys on her own, and now she was placing the truth before James. Whether it would be a gift or a burden was up to him. Sophia could take no more. With a sharp breath, she turned the pearls on her wedding gown trailing behind her as she walked toward the side exit. "This is a joke," she muttered loud enough for nearby guests to hear. James glanced after her and saw her pale face. Her perfect smile was now nothing more than a shattered mask. He wanted to call her back to salvage the moment, but he couldn't take his eyes off Aisha and the children. Sophia disappeared through the door, leaving James alone, beneath the curious and judging eyes of the crowd. The room seemed to shrink. The chandelier lights were too bright. The murmurs felt like tiny needles pricking his skin. He looked at Malik, the defiant glare, the same stubbornness he saw in himself. He looked at Noah, timid, holding his mother's hand, and felt an unfamiliar gentleness stir within. He looked at Isaiah, quiet, soulful, and saw a part of himself he never knew existed. They were his sons, and that truth weighed on him like a boulder pressed to his chest. Aisha bent down and whispered something to the boys. Malik nodded. Noah gave a faint smile. Isaiah squeezed her hand tighter. She straightened and looked at James one last time. Her gaze carried a clear message. She hadn't come to cause chaos. She had laid the truth at his feet, and now he had to face it. She said, "Let's go, boys." Her voice gentle, yet firm. She turned, leading Malik, Noah, and Isaiah toward the grand doors, strolling as if offering James one last chance to speak. James felt his feet nailed to the floor. He wanted to call out. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Why didn't you tell me? How old are they? Do they know who I am? But no sound left his lips. He, the man who always had the answers, could only stand in silence as Aisha and the boys walked away, their silhouettes shrinking in the doorway. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder. Some covered their mouths. Others turned to whisper to their companions. James heard the word scandal drift by, but he didn't care. His mind was filled with one thing: the image of the 3 boys, his sons, and the woman who had raised them without him. He turned to see the event manager looking at him with panic. "Mr. Carter, what should we do?" she asked, her voice shaky. James didn't respond. He walked past her toward the head table where his untouched glass of champagne still waited. He picked it up, but his hand trembled, a sensation foreign to him, even in billion-dollar negotiations. He looked out the window. The waves of Long Island still crashed calmly, as if the world hadn't just been upended. And in that moment, James admitted something to himself for the first time. He had been wrong. He had invited Aisha to make her regret. But now, it was he who stood face to face with regret. He had built an empire. But he had missed the one thing that truly mattered: his family. The images of Malik, Noah, and Isaiah burned into his mind alongside Aisha's unwavering gaze. She hadn't come to destroy him, but she had done so anyway, not with hatred, but with the truth. James set down his champagne glass, his eyes sharper than they'd been in years. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let Aisha and the boys disappear again. The wedding, his perfect stage, was now rubble. But for the first time in his life, James felt a purpose greater than power or fame. He had to find them. He had to face the truth Aisha had delivered. Outside, the waves kept rolling. But inside, James Carter, a storm had begun. James Carter stood alone in the grand hall of the Long Island seaside estate, crystal chandeliers casting cold, sharp light down upon him. Just minutes ago, Aisha Thompson, his black ex-wife, had entered with 3 young boys, Malik, Noah, and Isaiah, children he never knew existed. Her words still echoed in his mind like an irreversible verdict. "I came because they deserve to know who their father is." James, the 38-year-old white American man who once believed himself invincible, now felt the empire he had built crumbling beneath his feet. The crowd of guests, billionaires, politicians, celebrities, began to stir their whispers, spreading like ocean waves outside. James heard words like scandal and secrets drift by, but they were only background noise. His eyes remained fixed on the grand doors, where Aisha and the boys had exited, their silhouettes fading like a dream unraveling. Sophia Reynolds, his glamorous fiancée, had stormed off in fury, her pearl-studded wedding gown dragging behind her like an unspoken farewell. The wedding, his perfect stage crafted to consolidate his legacy, was now rubble. James felt a hand on his shoulder. Emma, his assistant, stood beside him, her face tense, but trying to remain composed. "Mr. Carter, what do you want us to do?" she asked, her voice low but urgent. James didn't answer. He stepped past her, walking toward the head table, where his glass of champagne remained untouched. He picked it up, but his hand trembled, a sensation he had never felt during billion-dollar negotiations. He looked out the window, watching the Long Island waves roll steadily. But inside him, a storm was roaring. His phone vibrated endlessly in his pocket. Investors, executives, Carter Tech's PR team. He knew what was happening. News of the wedding scandal had spread fast. A guest, likely a disguised journalist, had photographed Aisha and the three boys. The images were already going viral on social media. Carter Tech's stock was likely fluctuating. Competitors were laughing behind closed doors. The board would demand an emergency meeting. But James didn't care. His mind was filled with one thing: Malik's bold stare, Noah's timid smile, Isaiah's soulful eyes, his children. Children he had never known. He sat down for the first time that day, feeling the full weight of his own body. He had invited Aisha to make her regret, to prove he was right for choosing ambition over love. But she hadn't come as a defeated woman. She walked in with her head high, three boys, his blood at her side, and flipped the entire narrative. Aisha didn't need him. She didn't need his wealth or his power. She had built a life without him, and that truth hurt more than any failure he had ever faced. James ran a hand through his hair, trying to organize his thoughts. Why didn't she tell me? The question stabbed at him. He recalled their final phone call 10 years ago, when she said, "James, I don't want to be in contact anymore." He had thought she was just angry, that she would return once she realized how much he mattered. But she never did. She had vanished, and now he understood why. She had been pregnant. She had raised his children alone. He wanted to be angry at her, to blame her for keeping it from him. But deep down he knew he had no right. He had pushed her away. He had chosen his empire over her. And now he was paying the price. A memory surfaced, a quiet evening in San Francisco. Aisha sat beside him on their old couch, whispering her dream of capturing moments of happiness. "James, what do you want to preserve?" she had asked, her eyes glowing. He had laughed and said, "I want to maintain the world in my hands." She had looked at him, her gaze heavy with sadness, as if she had already seen the future they could never share. And now he realized she had preserved something far more precious: a family, children, while he had been left with wealth and reputation, things that now felt painfully hollow. James stood up, his eyes sharper now. He didn't know exactly what to do, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let Aisha and the children disappear again. He walked out of the grand hall, leaving behind the whispers and judgmental stares. Outside, the salty ocean air grounded him. He pulled out his phone, seeing dozens of missed calls and unread messages, but he searched for just one number: Aisha. The number he had saved 10 years ago and never deleted. He hit call. His heart pounded. 1 ring, 2, then voicemail. Aisha's voice came on calm, steady. "You've reached Aisha. Leave a message." James inhaled deeply. His voice, low and trembling, said, "Aisha, I need to see the boys. Please tell me where they are." He ended the call, staring at the ocean, feeling like he had just crossed a threshold he could never return from. The wedding was broken. His public image was shaken. But for the first time in his life, James felt a purpose greater than power. He had to find Aisha. He had to face his children. He had to make things right if she would give him the chance. The waves of Long Island still rolled in rhythm, but inside James a new resolve was rising. He didn't know what lay ahead, but knew he couldn't keep living as he had. Aisha had brought him the truth, and now he had to face it no matter the cost. James Carter sat in the penthouse on the 90th floor of a Manhattan tower, the lights of New York City stretching out below him like a shimmering tapestry. Just hours earlier, his world as a 38-year-old white American tech billionaire with blonde hair and piercing blue eyes had collapsed at a lavish wedding in Long Island. Aisha Thompson, his black ex-wife, had appeared with 3 boys, Malik, Noah, and Isaiah, children he had never known existed. Her words, "I came because they deserve to know who their father is," had shattered every calculated move he had made, leaving him in ruins of reputation and emotion. The penthouse, once a sanctuary of power, with its floor-to-ceiling glass walls and minimalist design, now felt empty, a hollow shell, reflecting a loneliness he had never admitted. His phone buzzed constantly, texts from PR calls from investors, emails from the Carter Tech board about the falling stock price after the wedding scandal. A trending headline glowed on the screen: "Billionaire James Carter, Family Secret Ruins Wedding of the Century." But James didn't open them. He just sat there, clutching his phone, staring at the voicemail he had left for Aisha. "Aisha, I need to see the boys. Please tell me where they are." He ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake the images: Malik's sharp, defiant stare, Noah's shy, fading smile, Isaiah's deep, searching eyes. They were his sons. But he didn't know. Them didn't know what they liked, feared, or dreamed of. That truth pierced him deeper than any business failure ever had. He had built an empire. He had conquered the world. But he had missed the one thing that mattered most: his family. And Aisha, the woman he once dismissed, the one he thought couldn't survive without him, had raised them alone while he drowned in power and prestige. James stood and walked to the window, gazing down at the city. He remembered when Aisha walked into the wedding hall, her head held high, the deep blue silk dress hugging her frame, and her unwavering brown eyes locked on him. She hadn't come to beg or cause chaos. She had come to lay the truth at his feet, and she had done it with a strength he had never seen in any boardroom rival. He wanted to be angry at her for keeping the boys from him, but he couldn't. He had driven her away 10 years ago. He had chosen Carter Tech over her, and now he was left to face the consequences. A memory surfaced an evening in San Francisco. Aisha curled beside him on their old couch. She had whispered, "James, what kind of people would you want them to be if we ever had kids?" He had laughed and said, "Winners. Like me." She had looked at him sad-eyed. "I want them to be happy." Back then he thought she was naive, but now he knew she was right. From what little he'd seen, Malik, Noah, and Isaiah weren't just surviving. They were happy. Because of Aisha. And he, with all his money and power, had no part in that. James returned to the table, grabbed a sheet of paper and a pen, a rarity for him in the digital age. He wrote at the top, Malik, Noah, Isaiah. Under each name, he jotted down what he remembered Malik. Bold, sharp eyes. Noah, shy, holding her hand. Isaiah, quiet, deep gaze. He stared at the paper, feeling foolish and desperate. That was all he knew. It wasn't enough. He needed to see them. He needed to know them. He needed to make things right. but he had no idea where to begin. He picked up his phone again and scrolled to Aisha's contact. His finger hovered over call. She wouldn't answer. He knew that. Aisha wasn't someone who forgave easily, not after everything. But he couldn't sit still. He pressed call. 1 ring, 2. Voicemail. Her voice came on calm, steady. "You've reached Aisha. Leave a message." James took a deep breath. His voice was low, honest. "Aisha, I'm sorry. I don't know where to begin, but I want to see the boys. I want to do the right thing. Please, give me a chance." He hung up, feeling as though he had shed part of a burden, but knowing that an apology was only the first step. James walked to the wardrobe, pulling out a plain coat instead of his usual cashmere. He wasn't going to Brooklyn as a billionaire. He was going as a man, as a father, even if he didn't know how to be one yet. Emma had sent him the address, a modest apartment in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, far from his Manhattan world. He stared at the address, imagining Aisha's life in that space, humble but filled with love and the laughter of their children. The thought filled him with both admiration and shame. He left the penthouse, stepped into the elevator for the first time in years, feeling uncertain. He had no plan, no strategy. The tools that built Carter Tech were useless here. All he had was a burning need to meet Malik, Noah, and Isaiah, to tell Aisha that he had been wrong and wanted to change. He stepped out into the freezing Manhattan air when the elevator doors opened. It cleared his head. He hailed a car and said to the driver, "Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn." As the city passed, skyscrapers gave way to Brooklyn's vibrant, lived-in neighborhoods. James thought of Aisha, of her strength, of how she had raised his sons without him. He thought of the years he had missed, the first steps, words, and birthdays he wasn't there for. Regret flooded him. But this time it didn't paralyze him. It fueled him. He was ready to face the past, to build a future. Not for his empire, but for his family. The car stopped in front of a red brick building in Bed-Stuy. James stepped out and looked up at the third-floor window, where warm yellow light spilled through the glass. He didn't know if Aisha would answer. I didn't know if she would let him in. But he knew one thing. He wasn't walking away. He took a deep breath and walked toward the door, ready to knock and prepared to face whatever waited on the other side. James Carter stood before the red brick building in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air. The 38-year-old white American man with tousled blonde hair and blue eyes brimming with resolve looked out of place in his simple coat, far removed from the image of a billionaire in a tailored suit. Just a day earlier, his world had collapsed at the Long Island wedding when his black ex-wife Aisha Thompson had appeared with 3 boys, Malik, Noah, and Isaiah, children he never knew existed. Now standing before Aisha's apartment, he was ready to face them, though his heart pounded like it did before billion-dollar deals. He had left 2 voicemails for Aisha, apologies, and pleased to meet the children. This morning she replied with a short message. Bed-Stuy Park, 10 a.m. Don't disappoint them. James looked at his watch. 9:55 a.m. He took a deep breath, crossed the bustling street where children laughed, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from a nearby bakery, and stepped into the small park ahead. Old oak trees offered generous shade. The creak of swings mingled with soft laughter. He saw her first, Aisha, seated on a bench, wrapped in a wool coat, her curly hair pulled high. Beside her were Malik, Noah, and Isaiah, each carrying a piece of his face, yet radiating Aisha's strength. Malik, 9, was tossing a basketball toward the hoop, eyes sharp and focused. Noah, 7, sat in the grass, fiddling with an action figure, his smile shy. Isaiah, 6, drew quietly in a sketchbook pencil, gliding smoothly. James paused a few meters away, feeling like an intruder in a world he didn't belong to. Aisha looked up, her deep brown eyes meeting his, not with hatred, but with the guarded gaze of a mother protecting her children. She didn't rise. She nodded an invitation. "Come forward if you're worthy." James stepped closer, hands in his coat pockets to hide the tremble. "Aisha," he said softly, "thank you for giving me this chance." She didn't respond immediately. She watched him as if measuring his sincerity. "They don't know what to call you," she finally said, voice calm but edged. "All they know is you're James Carter, the man from the wedding. The rest is up to you." Malik noticed him first. He stopped shooting and stood, tall eyes locked onto James. "You're him," he said. Not a question, but a statement. James nodded, trying to smile, but it was awkward. Nothing like his confident smile in boardrooms. "Yes, I am," he answered hoarsely. I came to meet you." Noah looked up from his toy eyes, curious but shy. He glanced at Aisha, as if waiting for her cue. Isaiah stopped drawing and tilted his head, those blue eyes identical to James's, studying him with unsettling depth. James felt all three gazes like silent questions. "Who are you to us? What do you want? Will you stay or disappear again?" "Why are you here?" Malik asked, tone-sharp arms crossed over the basketball. The question struck James, but he didn't dodge. He sat on a bench a few steps away from Aisha, trying not to intimidate her. "I'm here because I want to know you," he said sincerely. "I was wrong not to be here before. I want to make it right, if you'll let me." Malik frowned, skeptical. "Why now?" he challenged. James inhaled deeply. The truth was the only way forward. "I didn't know about you," he admitted. "Your mother didn't tell me, and that's my fault. I did things that made her not want to." He glanced at Aisha. She looked down at the ground, unreadable. Noah finally spoke, voice soft but clear. "Are you going to stay or leave again?" His innocent but piercing question stopped James's breath. He met Noah's brown eyes and saw a vulnerability he'd never faced even in himself. "I want to stay," James said, firmer now, "but I know I have to prove that." Isaiah, quiet, until now closed his sketchbook, rose and walked over. He looked up at James with mirror-like blue eyes, then asked, "Do you like to draw?" The question caught James off guard, but he smiled, feeling for the first time a flicker of connection. He confessed, "I'm not very good at it, but I'd love to see what you draw." Isaiah nodded, saying nothing more, but he didn't walk away. A small sign of acceptance. Aisha observed, not interfering. She let the boys decide how to respond, but her eyes said everything. One wrong move, and this ends. James felt the weight of that unspoken warning, but it didn't scare him. It focused on him. He looked at the boys, Malik, Noah, and Isaiah. They didn't trust him. Not yet. Not after all the years he'd missed. But they hadn't walked away. They were still talking, and that was enough. Malik tossed the basketball to James, his stare defiant. "Are you any good?" he asked. James caught it, stood and smiled. "Used to be," he said gently. "Wanna see?" Malik shrugged, then jogged toward the court, motioning for James to follow. Noah stood, tugged Isaiah's sleeve, and both walked with Aisha to the edge of the court. Aisha remained seated, but her eyes softened just a little. James took a shot, deliberately easy, letting Malik steal the ball. The boys smirked and scored. James saw a flicker of joy in Malik's eyes for the first time. Noah clapped. Isaiah sat in the grass again, sketchbook open. James watched them, a strange warmth blooming in his chest. He hadn't known what he was missing, but now that he'd seen it, he couldn't look away. He knew the road ahead would be long, filled with tests and hesitation. But for the first time, James was ready to walk it not as a billionaire, but as a father. The small kitchen in Aisha Thompson's Bed-Stuy apartment was filled with the scent of fresh coffee and just-baked cookies. A soft golden light glowed above the worn wooden table, where Aisha, a 35-year-old Black American woman, stood at the sink washing dishes. Her curly hair was tied up high, and her deep brown eyes reflected a strong and scarred soul. Across from her sat James Carter, a 38-year-old white American man, once her husband, now in a plain shirt. His piercing blue eyes held both determination and unease. Just weeks ago, Aisha had shattered James's carefully curated world at his lavish Long Island wedding by walking in with 3 boys, Malik, Noah, and Isaiah, his sons, who were unknown to him until that moment. Now, in this intimate space, they faced each other not as enemies, but as 2 people trying to find common ground for the sake of their children. James had been present in their lives since that first meeting in the park. He showed up to Malik's basketball games, cheered for Noah at his school play, and sat beside Isaiah as the boys sketched emotion-filled drawings. But with Aisha, he was still a stranger, a man who had once wounded her deeply, and she wasn't quick to open her heart again. Tonight, with the children asleep behind closed doors, Aisha agreed to let James stay and talk. For the first time in 10 years, they sat across from each other like this. James ran a hand through his hair, breaking the silence. "Aisha," he began softly, "why didn't you tell me about the kids?" The question had lived in him since the wedding. Now it spilled out raw and trembling. Aisha stopped scrubbing. Her hand clenched the sponge. She turned to him, her gaze steady, not angry, but guarded the look of someone who had survived betrayal. "I tried," she said, voice calm but sharp. "When I found out I was pregnant with Malik, I called you. You remember what you said, James? I don't have time for this. I knew then if I told you, you'd try to control them, or worse, abandon them, like you abandoned me." Her words cut like a blade, but James didn't flinch. He bowed his head, hands tightening on the table. He knew she was right. "I was wrong," he admitted, voice hoarse. "I put everything, my company, my ambition above you. I didn't know what I had lost until you entered that wedding." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want to do right by Malik, Noah, and Isaiah." Aisha dried her hands and sat across from him, still guarded. "Words are easy, James," she said. "I've raised them alone for 10 years. I worked 3 jobs, edited nightly photos, and cried in the bathroom so they wouldn't see. You can't just show up and expect everything to reset." She paused, her eyes softening as she spoke of the boys. "But they're starting to like you. Malik told me how awful your jump shot is. Noah asked if you'd come to his next play. And Isaiah, he drew you in his latest sketch." James gave a faint smile, heart warmed yet heavy. "I don't know how to be a father," he confessed. "I'm scared I'll disappoint them, but I don't want to miss another day." He rubbed his face, inhaling deeply. "I've scaled back at Carter Tech, gave more responsibility to the board. I don't want them growing up with a father who only knows work." Aisha frowned, searching his face. "Why now?" "James," she asked quietly, "why not 10 years ago when I begged you to stay?" The question stabbed at him, but he didn't deflect. "Because I was a fool," he said simply. "I thought success was everything. Then I saw you and the boys and realized what I'd thrown away. I missed their first steps, their birthdays, their bedtime stories. I can't get that time back, but I can be here now, if you'll let me." Aisha said nothing at first. Her eyes swept across the kitchen, the crayon drawings by Isaiah, taped to the fridge, Malik's basketball under the chair, and Noah's action figure on the shelf. She had built a home without him. Now he was asking for a place in it. My kids are my priority, she said firmly. If you hurt them, James, I won't forgive you. Ever. I understand, he said, voice steady. I won't promise to be perfect, but I promise to try. If you'll have me, I want to be part of their lives. And yours. Those last words made Aisha pause. Her eyes lingered on him, searching for the man she once loved. She didn't answer immediately, but the silence between them no longer felt like a wall. She stood, walked to the cupboard, and returned with 2 mugs of coffee. Setting one in front of him, she said softly, "Drink. We've got a long way to go, but this is a start." James took the cup, its warmth seeping into his hands. He looked at Aisha, and for the first time saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the door was no longer shut. Outside the window, Brooklyn buzzed with lights and late-night sounds. James knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, earning Aisha's trust and bonding with his sons. But for the first time he felt he was moving in the right direction. Not for power, not for redemption, but for a family one he was determined never to lose again. Bed-Stuy Park in Brooklyn glowed under the golden hue of the late afternoon sun. The old oak trees cast wide shadows over the lush green grass, where children's laughter mingled with the creak of swings and the rhythmic bounce of a basketball. James Carter, a 38-year-old white American man, stood at the edge of the court. His sleeves were rolled up, and sweat tousled his blonde hair. He tossed the ball to Malik, the bold-eyed 9-year-old, who looked just like him. Malik snatched it with ease, grinned mischievously, and sank the shot with smooth precision. "You still suck," Malik teased, but the smile on his face was genuine, a sign that a bond was beginning to take root. A few yards away, Aisha Thompson, a 35-year-old Black American woman, sat on a bench, her curly hair tied up high, a light sweater draped over her shoulders. She held a cup of coffee and oversaw them, her deep brown eyes scanning James and the boys, Malik, Noah, and Isaiah, with a blend of caution and warmth. Just a few months ago, she had shattered James's life at a lavish Long Island wedding, revealing the existence of 3 sons he had never known. Now they were building something new, fragile, hopeful, not for the past, but for the future of their children. Noah, 7, ran toward James, his face beaming, holding up a Superman toy. "Look, look!" he yelled, lifting it to the sky. "It can fly." James knelt, smiling, an honest, unguarded smile he hadn't known he possessed. "Really, show me," he said. Noah threw the toy, laughing as it tumbled through the air and landed in the grass. James picked it up and handed it back, feeling his heart swell. Noah was still shy, but moments like this, small and tender, were pulling them closer. Isaiah, 6, sat beside Aisha, a sketchbook open on his lap. His blue eyes, much like James's, were focused as his pencil swept gently across the page. James glanced over and saw the drawing, a family of 5 standing beneath an oak tree, hand in hand. He recognized himself, a tall figure with blonde hair following Aisha and the 3 boys. He swallowed hard, overwhelmed. Isaiah hadn't called him Dad yet, but this drawing was an invitation. A door quietly creaked open. Since the wedding, James has changed. He scaled back his role at Carter Tech, handed more responsibility to the board, and let his image take a hit so he could be present for his family. The company's stock still fluctuated. Rivals still smirked. But James no longer cared. He came to Brooklyn almost every day, not as a billionaire, but as a man learning how to love. He practiced basketball with Malik, but he was always losing. He clapped the loudest at Noah's school play. He listened to Isaiah talk about his drawings, which were few words but full of meaning. Every moment was a step forward, though he knew the road was long. Aisha stood and walked toward the court, her gaze passing over James. She was still cautious, still guarded. But the late-night conversations in her kitchen, those coffee-fueled exchanges filled with truth and pain, had begun softening old wounds. Malik stopped bullying him. She called voice, teasing but warm. He brings it on himself. Mom, Malik shouted back, sinking another shot. James laughed, an easy, honest laugh. He walked over to Aisha, standing beside her as they watched the boys. Thank you, he said softly, for giving me this chance. She looked at him, her gaze searching like always. Don't thank me, she replied. Just keep showing up, James. That's what they need. He nodded, knowing that this promise made to the boys and her was one he couldn't break. A memory flashed through his mind, an evening in San Francisco when Aisha had once asked him what he wanted their kids to become. He had said winners. She said happy. And now he understood she had already raised winners, not through power or wealth, but through love and resilience. You did amazing, he said, voice thick. Malik, Noah, Isaiah. They're incredible because of you. Aisha smiled, rare and real. They're your kids too, she replied. And in those words was a glimmer of hope, an invitation for James to become part of the story. Isaiah ran over, holding up his drawing. For you, he said softly but clearly. James took it, his fingers trembling as they traced the paper. Thank you, Isaiah, he murmured, his voice barely steady. I'll keep it forever. The boy nodded, then dashed back toward Malik and Noah. James looked at Aisha, and her eyes had softened just a bit. She had seen the drawing too, and maybe, just maybe, she saw in it a beginning. The sun dipped lower, casting the park in amber light. Aisha clapped her hands. Kids, it's time to go. Malik groaned. Noah ran into her arms, and Isaiah gently closed his sketchbook. James stood there watching them, knowing he could never return to his old life, one built on power and image. He wanted to be here, in afternoons like this, with laughter and drawings, and a family he was learning to love. Aisha turned to him. You coming tomorrow? She asked, her voice light but weighted. James smiled for the first time. Sure. Tomorrow. And every day after that. She didn't reply, but the hint of a smile on her lips was enough. James lingered as Aisha and the boys walked ahead, watching their silhouettes fade. He clutched Isaiah's drawing like a treasure. Brooklyn buzzed around him, alive with light and noise. But for the first time, he felt he belonged here. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Trust would take time, and the past would need mending. But for the first time, James Carter was ready to fight for what truly mattered.